one of my tamer scenes, so, all right. Running through the forest, Emily felt her breathing settling into a steady rhythm, one that would enable her to keep the pace for the next few miles. To her relief, the strappy sandals Zaires had given her sat snugly on her feet, without even a hint of the rubbing discomfort one normally expected with such footwear. Though the last 2 years had been tough, with her job consuming nearly all of her waking hours, Emily had usually managed to sneak in a 5-mile run every couple of days. It didn't compare to the rigorous fitness regimen she had in college, but it was still better than turning into a complete couch potato, and she was extremely grateful for those runs now. She could feel her muscles warming and stretching, her lungs working easily, and she knew she would be able to keep this up for at least an hour. By then, Zaires should be far behind her, assuming he even bothered to come after her once he reached the shore. If all went well, she would not see him again. The thought was strangely upsetting, so she pushed it out of her mind. There was no going back now. For better or for worse, she had escaped, and now she needed to make sure she found civilization quickly. Just 1 foot in front of the other, Emily. 1 foot in front of the other. Focusing on the familiar runner's refrain, she leapt over a fallen log and ran smack into an impossibly hard body. The impact knocked all breath out of her. Reeling back, she tripped over the log and would have fallen if strong hands hadn't caught her at that moment. In a flash, she found herself stretched on the ground on her back, her arms pinned above her head, with 6 feet plus of dripping wet, muscular males sprawled on top of her. Zaires, he had somehow caught up with her. He was breathing hard, and she could see a muscle pulsing in his tightly clenched jaw. His dark hair was plastered against his skull, his black eyes glittering like coals. He looked savage and utterly furious.
"Where the fuck do you think you're going?"
His voice was a feral growl, his fingers like a steel vice around her wrists.
"You can't run from me."
Her lungs finally starting to function, Emily greedily sucked in air, trying to gather her wits. How had he gotten here so quickly from the middle of the lake? Even the best Olympic swimmer couldn't have covered that distance in such a short time. What? How did you? She couldn't seem to get more than a few words out through the thunderous pounding of blood in her ears. She could feel every inch of his hard, half-naked body, the moisture from his skin seeping into her dress, and her flesh reacted instantly, her nipples puddling into taut, erect buds.
"How did I what?"
He lowered his head until his face was only a couple of inches from her own, his gaze burning into her.
"How did I catch you?"
Emily managed to nod.
"I can always catch you."
His voice softened to a hoarse whisper, and a hotter, darker gleam appeared in his eyes.
"There's no place on this planet or beyond where I wouldn't be able to find you, Angel, if I were so inclined."
Her heart skipped a beat, then began to gallop madly in her chest. She could feel a growing hardness against her leg, and an answering heat flooded her body. Even his deepening awareness of her own vulnerability made her stomach sink. "Let go," she whispered, straining against his hold. It was like being pinned down by a mountain, and the sense of helplessness was both frightening and maddening. "Zaires, let me go." He stared at her, his jaw muscle flexing, and the blazing hunger on his face sent a surge of alarmed excitement through her. She could sense him battling for control, and she knew the exact moment when he lost the battle. With a tortured groan, he lowered his head and captured her mouth with his. There was nothing sweet and tender about this kiss. It was a raw, carnal claiming. His lips and tongue were everywhere, consuming her, stealing away her breath, her will to resist. His right hand effortlessly held both of her wrists above her head, while his left slid down her body, fisting in her skirt and pulling it up. Wherever his fingers brushed against her skin, her flesh was left burning, aching for his touch. Over overwhelmed. Emily arched against him, uncertain if she wanted to get closer or throw him off, and felt his knee parting her naked thighs as his hand grabbed her bikini bottoms, ripping them off. Only the wet material of his shorts separated them now, the heavy pressure of his erection pushing against her exposed sex. Suddenly, her hands were free. Gasping, she grabbed at his shoulders, her fingers digging into his skin as he began a rocking motion with his hips, sending waves of heat throughout her body. He was still kissing her, with deep, drugging kisses that clouded her mind, and somewhere low within her belly, a familiar tension began to build as his hand pulled off her bikini top and closed around her breast, firmly massaging the soft weight under the thin fabric of her dress. Her head swimming, Emily moaned into his mouth, unable to focus on anything but the dizzying pleasure surging through her. All her fears, all her doubts evaporated, burned away in the searing heat of his embrace. Her fingers slid into his hair, holding him closer as her hips began to move in an answering rhythm. He groaned again, and she dimly registered another ripping sound. He'd torn off his shorts, she realized vaguely. The tension inside her intensified, her core throbbing with molten need, and she lifted her hips toward him, unconsciously begging for more. At her move, his body stiffened on top of hers, and he raised his head to stare down at her, holding himself propped up on one elbow. His breathing was harsh and fast, his lips shining from their kisses. "Tell me you want this," he whispered, his voice hoarse with lust. He nudged his hips forward, the tip of his shaft pressing into the soft notch between her legs. "Tell me you want this, Emily." His eyes bore into her, demanding an answer, and she nodded helplessly, unable to do anything else. She'd never known such aching want, a desire so intense it bordered on agony. She wouldn't be able to bear it if he stopped now, and her usual voice of caution remained silent as he grasped her thigh with one strong hand, opening her legs wider, and began to push in.